Charles Goodnight once signed a cattle delivery contract with a man most people today have never heard of. An Ohio farm boy whose parents had wanted him to become a Methodist minister, and who became instead the undisputed cattle king of the entire Great Plains. The world remembers Goodnight's name. It barely remembers his. Records show John Wesley Iliff was born on December 18, 1831, in the small Ohio settlement of McClooney, to Thomas Iliff and Salome Reed, a wealthy, devoutly Methodist family who named their son after the founder of Methodism itself and expected him to grow into the ministry, the same way countless Methodist families of that generation hoped at least one son might answer a religious calling. His father, Thomas, was himself a cattleman, and had already taught his son a good deal about the practical realities of raising and managing large herds, even while hoping the boy's future lay elsewhere, in a pulpit rather than a pasture. They sent him to Ohio Wesleyan University, the denomination's own college, built specifically to produce the next generation of Methodist leaders. It didn't take. Iliff left without graduating, restless in a way his family hadn't planned for and didn't entirely know what to do with. In 1849, at 18 years old, he asked his father for a small loan and left Ohio for the first time, heading west to test his fortune. He came home with nothing but another lesson. For 8 years, that failure was the only proof he had that leaving Ohio had ever been a mistake. 8 years later, in 1857, at 26, he asked again. This time, his father didn't just lend him money. He handed his son $500 in cash outright, less a vote of confidence than a quiet admission that the boy was going to do something with his life, whether the family approved of the shape of it or not, and that it was better to send him off properly than watch him leave with nothing a second time. Neither of them could have known that those $500 would eventually become one of the largest cattle fortunes in the American West. Iliff took the money to Ohio City, Kansas, and opened a small retail store. If it failed, too, there would be no third loan to ask for. 2 years later, in 1859, word reached Kansas that gold had been discovered in the mountains west of Denver. Iliff moved again, opening a new dry goods store on Blake Street in Denver, selling groceries, provisions, and clothing to prospectors passing through on their way to the diggings. It's easy to focus on the gold rush itself, but what Iliff actually noticed was something happening at the edges of it. Wagon trains and lone travelers rolled into Denver every week that summer, most of them looking only toward the mountains, thinking about gold. Almost nobody was looking at the corrals, immigrants and prospectors crossing hundreds of miles of open plains toward Denver arrived with cattle that were often sick, injured, lame, or simply worn down to skin and bone from the journey. Oxen limping on cracked hooves, cows too exhausted to be worth the trouble of driving another mile. Animals worth very little to travelers desperate to reach the goldfields with whatever strength they had left. While everyone else in Denver scanned the horizon for a strike in the hills, Iliff was standing in the stockyards, buying the animals nobody else wanted. He started purchasing those weary cattle for next to nothing, sometimes for a few dollars a head, moving them onto rented pasture near town and letting them rest and fatten on grass that cost him almost nothing to use. It almost wasn't enough on its own. Plenty of small-time traders tried the same basic idea and never turned it into anything larger than a modest side business. The insight underneath this was simple, and almost nobody else in Denver was acting on it yet. Worthless cattle plus free grass plus time equaled a profitable herd, sold to the mining camps that were desperate for fresh beef and in no position to be picky about price. In 1861, Iliff made a choice that most of Denver's shopkeepers would have considered reckless. He sold the store entirely. Selling it meant burning the bridge behind him. If cattle failed, there was nowhere left to return to. The following year, he established his first proper ranch on the South Platte River, northeast of Denver, near Fort Lupton, starting with roughly 25,000 head of cattle and just under 8,000 acres of land. Using the Homestead Act to expand his holdings after the Civil War, and importing shorthorn bulls from Ohio to improve the quality of his herd rather than simply its size, Iliff built something that looked less like a rancher's operation and more like an early industrial supply chain. Cattle bought cheap, bred deliberately, fattened on open range, and delivered on contract to whoever needed beef in a region that produced almost none of its own. That still wasn't the real opportunity. He didn't know it yet. But every decision he'd made until then had only been preparing him for the opportunity that was still rolling toward Colorado on steel rails. He also crossed paths in these very years with two of the biggest names moving cattle up out of Texas. Men whose own instincts couldn't have been more different from each other. In the fall of 1866, after Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving sold their steers to the Army at Fort Sumner, they were left with 700 or 800 stocker cattle the government had no interest in buying. Goodnight, always the one already looking toward the next herd, turned back toward Texas to start over. Loving, older, more patient, and less inclined to leave money on the table, pushed the leftover cattle north instead, through Rayton Pass, paying the mountain man Dick Wooten his toll of 10 cents a head, and on into Denver, where he sold the entire remaining herd directly to a stock dealer barely anyone outside Colorado had heard of yet. John Wesley Iliff. It was, by any measure, a strange handoff. Loving had no way of knowing it would be one of the last deals he ever made. Gangrene would set into a wound from a Comanche attack the following summer, and he'd be dead within the year. While the unknown buyer in Denver was only just beginning to build the operation that would eventually dwarf anything Goodnight and Loving had built on the trail together. In the spring of 1868, Goodnight formalized the relationship further, signing a contract to deliver his own cattle directly to Iliff at the new Union Pacific Railroad town of Cheyenne, a route that would stay in regular use for over a decade. Iliff wasn't driving cattle 1,000 miles to a railhead the way Goodnight was. He'd realized something different. If you could raise cattle directly on the northern plains instead of trailing them up from Texas every season, you didn't need the trail at all. You just needed grass, water, and a market close enough to reach, and, crucially, cattle hardy enough to survive a northern winter without being fed by hand, something Iliff demonstrated Texas Longhorns could do far better than most ranchers of the era expected. By 1866, Denver's business directories listed him simply as a stock dealer. He was, by then, selling beef to mining camps, to the city of Cheyenne, to army posts along the frontier, and to Indian reservations under government contract. A solid, respectable business by any measure of the time. But nothing that had happened so far was the thing that would actually make him rich. That was still coming, on rails from the east. History would later reveal the importance of that moment. The Union Pacific Railroad announced it would build its transcontinental line through southern Wyoming, funneling thousands of construction laborers, graders, track layers, tie cutters, surveyors, into remote country with no local food supply of its own, hundreds of miles from the nearest established farm or ranch. Before a railroad reached a stretch of country like that, a distant market barely existed at all. There was no practical way to move enough beef in or enough live cattle out to matter. After the rails went in, a single railroad town could suddenly consume thousands of head of cattle without producing a single one itself, and ship thousands more east to Chicago in the same week. Iliff understood that he wasn't simply selling steers anymore. He was provisioning a piece of national infrastructure while it was still being built, one hungry construction camp at a time. Every mile of track being laid represented another camp of hungry men who needed feeding, in places where the nearest alternative source of fresh beef might be a week's ride away. In 1867, he established a cow camp 5 miles south of Cheyenne, positioning his herds directly along the railroad's advancing path, ready to move cattle to whichever construction camp needed them next. By 1868, he'd moved his base of operations to Cheyenne itself to manage the growing contracts more closely. No longer just a rancher, but something closer to a quartermaster for an entire construction project moving west across the plains. The opportunity kept compounding. In 1869, former Colorado Territorial Governor John Evans, a shrewd, well-connected founder of institutions in his own right, not a man who handed out contracts casually or to unproven suppliers, awarded Iliff the contract to feed construction crews on the newly planned Denver Pacific Railroad, linking Denver to Cheyenne. It was the kind of contract that came only to a supplier whose reliability was already well established. Evans wasn't gambling on an unknown quantity. He was formalizing a relationship with the one man in the territory everyone already knew could deliver beef on schedule, at the scale a railroad required. Iliff could have stayed content with what he already had. He didn't. Instead, he gambled the operation's future on serving railroads that didn't exist yet, in country that had barely been surveyed. Combined with his existing Union Pacific contracts, Army contracts, reservation contracts, and sales to wholesale butchers, Iliff was, within a few years, shipping cattle to the Chicago stockyards at a rate of 1 or 2 rail cars a day. By 1870, he held more than 26,000 head of cattle on upward of 16,000 acres. By the final years of his life, contemporary accounts describe him as able to travel for a full week across his own range without ever needing to sleep outside one of his own ranch houses. His holdings, by then, stretched roughly 100 miles from north of Denver into Wyoming and eastward toward the Nebraska line, with his cattle at times ranging as far south as Texas itself, numbering by some accounts as many as 50,000 head. Despite all of it, Iliff was widely described as a plain, hands-on cattleman rather than a distant owner. He rode his own range personally rather than managing from an office, inspecting herds by eye, choosing his own foreman based on who he'd actually seen work cattle rather than who came recommended, and settling on the spot whether a lot of animals was worth buying by walking through it himself. Contemporaries who knew the trade said no one else on the frontier matched his skill at running an operation of that size. That advantage wouldn't last forever. Something was already coming that even John Wesley Iliff couldn't outwork. The economics underneath it all were unglamorous but precise. A good trail crew ran on a handful of specialized roles, from the trail boss down to the cook, each paid according to how much the whole outfit depended on them. Iliff didn't just supply the beef at the end of that chain. For years, he understood every link in it personally. None of that protected him from everything. A single hard winter, a single broken contract, a single bad season of prices could still have unraveled an operation this size as easily as it had unraveled smaller ones all across the plains. And Iliff knew it. The business kept growing for another decade. But the part of Iliff's life that history remembers least wasn't happening on the range at all. Iliff's personal life carried its own losses, largely invisible in the ledgers that otherwise document his career so thoroughly. In 1865, he married Sarah Elizabeth Smith in Ohio City, Kansas. They had one son, William. Sarah died not long after. The surviving records are thin on the details, though losing a young wife was, as with so many families on this frontier, simply an ordinary hazard of the era rather than a notable exception to it. In 1868, in Cheyenne, Iliff met Elizabeth "Lizzie" Fraser, a 24-year-old sewing machine saleswoman recently arrived in the territory, trying to build a living for herself in a raw railroad town far from anywhere she'd started out. They married in Chicago in 1871 and moved to Denver a few years later. Together, they had 3 more children: Edna, Louise, and a son, John Wesley Iliff, Jr., born in 1877, who lived only briefly before dying in infancy the following year, in the same stretch of months that would also take his father. In December of 1877, after 2 decades of relentless travel across an empire he'd built almost entirely from nothing, Iliff fell seriously ill. He died on February 9, 1878, at 46 years old, of complications from gallbladder disease, cut down in the middle of his working life, still very much the same restless man who'd left Ohio at 18 with nothing but a small loan from his father. He was buried in Denver's Riverside Cemetery, later moved to Fairmount. In the years afterward, a small Colorado railroad town took his name, Iliff, Colorado, along with a long stretch of road in Denver and neighboring Aurora that still carries it today, running, fittingly enough, right past the seminary his fortune would eventually help build. He left no will. The courts awarded his widow, Elizabeth, stewardship over an estate, land, cattle, contracts, and investments combined, that made him, by most accounts, one of the wealthiest men in the American West. A fortune worth millions of dollars built entirely from a $500 loan a father had once handed his restless son with no particular confidence in how it would be spent. Put simply, in roughly 20 years, Iliff had turned that loan into a fortune worth many thousands of times what he'd started with, without ever once striking gold, discovering silver, or finding a vein of anything buried in the ground. He'd found his fortune entirely on the surface, in cattle other men were happy to be rid of and grass nobody else thought to charge for. What happened to that fortune afterward is its own story. Elizabeth Iliff was still in her early 30s, widowed with small children, when one of the largest cattle operations in the American West landed suddenly in her hands, the kind of inheritance almost nobody expected a woman that age to hold on to, let alone grow. It wasn't a quiet transition. Bankers, cattle buyers, and rival ranchers who'd dealt only with her husband now had to decide whether to take a young widow seriously as the person actually making the decisions, and more than a few of them assumed, wrongly, that she'd sell out quickly and take whatever price she was offered. She didn't. She personally asked the Snyder brothers, established Texas cattlemen, to help manage the herd, and ran the business herself for years afterward, deliberately spreading the fortune beyond cattle alone, investing in Denver real estate, taking stock positions in the German National Bank and the City National Bank of Denver, and buying into shares of Chicago's Union stockyards. That diversification mattered more than it might sound. Cattle fortunes on this frontier had a well-earned reputation for vanishing in a single bad winter or a single bad market year, and spreading the Iliff wealth across land, banking, and rail-connected infrastructure gave it a kind of durability that pure ranching rarely offered. By most accounts, the Iliff fortune grew significantly under her direct management, long before she resigned as administrator in 1883 and eventually sold the last of the cattle in 1898. She became, by any measure, one of the wealthiest women in Colorado, and very possibly the wealthiest cattle owner, male or female, in the entire country at that time. Seen from another angle, this is the same pattern that shows up again and again in these stories. An empire built by one restless, ambitious person, and then actually preserved, sometimes even grown, by a widow the history books remember far less than they should. It's the same shape of story as the one behind Margaret Borland, a few states south. A woman handed a fortune she wasn't expected to hold on to, who ended up managing it better than most of the men around her assumed she could. Elizabeth herself had grown up with little enough security of her own. Born in Ontario, Canada, in 1844, she lost her mother young and was sent, along with at least one brother, to live with relatives in Illinois before eventually making her own way west to Cheyenne as a young saleswoman with nothing guaranteed to her either. The family that had once hoped John Wesley Iliff would become a Methodist minister never got that wish. Instead, he spent his life buying exhausted cattle other men were glad to be rid of, and grazing them on grass nobody thought to charge for. Yet, in 1884, when Elizabeth donated $100,000 to the University of Denver to establish a graduate school of theology, decades after his death, it was the fortune from those cattle, routed through a widow's checkbook, a Methodist bishop, and a building whose cornerstone quotes Scripture, that ended up educating generations of the very ministers his family had once pictured him becoming himself. In 1883, Elizabeth had married the bishop, Henry White Warren, in Denver's Evans Chapel. Together, the couple pushed the theological school from dream into brick and stone. The cornerstone of Iliff Hall was laid on June 8, 1892, carved with the words, "Christ Jesus Himself," being the chief cornerstone, and classes began that same September, even before construction was finished. The school's early years were harder than its founding suggested they'd be. After a national financial panic in 1893, money grew scarce, and for years afterward it was, by more than one account, Elizabeth's own personal checkbook, quietly written against, that kept the doors open at all. The school finally closed for lack of funds in 1900, and didn't reopen for a full decade, reincorporating in 1910 as a fully independent institution, separate from the University of Denver, still standing today as the Iliff School of Theology. The Iliff name never really left Colorado after that. The open-range model he'd pioneered, raising cattle directly on the northern plains instead of trailing them endlessly up from Texas, became the template countless other Colorado and Wyoming ranchers built their own operations on in the decades that followed, long after his own herds had been sold off and dispersed. A small town on the eastern plains still carries his name. So does a long stretch of road in Denver and neighboring Aurora, running, fittingly enough, right past the seminary his fortune helped build. None of it was the ministry his parents once imagined. All of it, in one roundabout way or another, still came from the same restless refusal to become what he was expected to be. The $500 his father handed him in 1857 was never really about cattle in the end. It was about a family expecting one kind of legacy and getting instead the raw material for a completely different one. One that eventually circled back, decades later, and paid for the very thing they'd wanted all along. If it's worth knowing the names standing quietly behind the more famous ones, subscribe. There's a lot more of this history still waiting.